Mid-October last year, after months of driving between hospitals across Michigan, I scheduled a quiet weekend alone along the southern shoreline of Lake Superior. I was 44 and spending most of my weekdays in rental cars, conference rooms, and parking garages. The trip wasn't meant to be memorable. I booked a small lakeside rental called Shoreline Cottage, Unit B, about 20 minutes outside a fishing town near Munising. My plan was simple: walk the rocky shoreline, review territory reports for the next quarter, and ignore my phone for 2 days. The cottage sat close enough to the lake that cold wind pressed steadily against the walls all evening. If you appreciate realistic horror accounts told quietly like this, consider subscribing for the next one. The property consisted of 3 identical cottages built along a narrow bluff above the lake. October was considered off-season that far north, and the listing had promised quiet solitude. I arrived Friday evening just before sunset, entered the key code 9083 on the lockbox, and carried my groceries inside. The wind coming off the water had that steady weight Lake Superior produces, cold enough to make the air feel heavier than it should. Only one other vehicle was visible when I parked. A dark pickup truck sat outside Unit A, the cottage closest to the shoreline steps. The presence of another guest didn't bother me. If anything, it made the place feel slightly less remote. After unpacking, I spent a while standing near the window listening to the slow, regular sound of waves hitting rock below the bluff. While putting groceries away, I noticed the pickup truck's headlights switch on briefly outside Unit A. They stayed on for maybe 15 seconds before shutting off again. The truck never moved. A few minutes later, while heating soup on the stove, the headlights came on again. The engine didn't start, just the lights. Then darkness again. I assumed the person staying there had stepped out to check something inside the vehicle. It wasn't unusual. The gravel parking strip shifted slightly whenever the wind pushed loose pebbles along it, and the lake kept its slow rhythm below the bluff. The truck itself looked ordinary, an older dark green Ford pickup. Later that night, I stepped outside for a moment. The truck was still exactly where it had been earlier, facing the lake. As I watched, the headlights flicked on again without the vehicle moving, casting a pale beam across the gravel and the side of Cottage A. They shut off a few seconds later. Saturday morning, the truck hadn't moved overnight. One detail had changed. The driver's door now stood slightly open. I never saw anyone come or go from that cottage all day. Throughout the afternoon, the headlights flashed on occasionally for a few seconds, then off again, always without the engine starting. The pattern wasn't frequent enough to seem mechanical, but it happened enough times to keep drawing my attention back to the window. The wind carried steadily across the gray surface of the lake while the narrow stairway, 26 wooden steps, descended toward the rocks below. By Saturday evening, the truck had been sitting in that exact position for more than 24 hours. No lights appeared inside Cottage A the entire time. No door opened. No shadow crossed the curtains. At 7:18 p.m., while I stood near the kitchen window, the headlights flashed on again. I began wondering if the electrical system was malfunctioning. Maybe the battery had been left on earlier, or the wiring was failing. Vehicles sometimes behaved strangely when exposed to cold wind and moisture that close to the lake. A loose chain hanging from my porch railing tapped softly against the wood while I watched the driveway and tried to convince myself the situation was explainable. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror stories like this, leave a like. After dark, I decided to walk over and check on the cottage. The decision wasn't dramatic. It was the practical thing to do if someone had accidentally left their vehicle running or their door open overnight. The wind had grown stronger by then, pushing the sound of the lake higher up the bluff. As I approached the truck, I saw the interior dome light glowing faintly. The driver's seat was empty. Through the windshield, I could clearly see the keys still in the ignition. The odometer read 178,442 miles. While I was standing there, the headlights suddenly switched on again. The engine didn't turn over, only the lights. They illuminated the gravel driveway and the side wall of the cottage beside me. At that exact moment, I heard movement behind the building, slow footsteps moving through dry leaves near the tree line. Not running, not hiding, just a steady shifting of weight across the ground. I called out once, assuming whoever stayed there might be outside somewhere behind the cottage. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound itself. Standing beside the truck, I realized something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I had never actually seen anyone enter that cottage all weekend. I walked back toward Unit B without waiting for a response. Once inside my cottage, I locked the door and decided not to investigate further. The truck remained where it was, the headlights off again. The wind coming off the lake had turned colder overnight, pushing against the walls in steady bursts. Around midnight, the headlights flashed on one final time. From my window, I watched the empty driveway glow briefly under the beam. A few minutes later, I heard a vehicle somewhere along the gravel road, leading away from the property. The sound faded slowly into the distance. When morning arrived, the parking area outside Unit A was completely empty. The pickup truck was gone. Before leaving Sunday morning, I walked past Cottage A on my way to the car. The door stood slightly open. Inside, the cottage appeared completely empty. No luggage, no groceries, no clothing, nothing that suggested someone had spent the night there. The wind pushed lightly against a loose screen door, making it tap against the frame at irregular intervals. One detail stood out when I looked up at the porch light. The bulb had been unscrewed halfway from the socket. A faded welcome mat beneath the door read "Superior Stay." On the drive back toward Marquette, curiosity made me check the rental listing again on my phone. The property description only showed 2 cottages available for booking. Unit B, the one I had stayed in, and Unit C. The listing made no mention of a Unit A at all. My confirmation email still read Shoreline Cottage, Unit B. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who appreciates grounded, realistic horror, and subscribe for the next account. Early last April, after a run of municipal inspections and compressed deadlines, I rented a cabin outside Asheville for the weekend alone. I was 43, working as a civil engineering consultant, and most weeks felt interchangeable. Road clothes, hotel coffee, drainage reports, and the steady habit of answering messages too late at night. I wanted 2 quiet nights to read, hike, and ignore email without feeling temporarily reachable. By the time I unlocked cabin 12 at Ridge Laurel Retreat, cool mountain air was drifting through the kitchen window and making the place feel briefly separate from the rest of my life. Subscribe for more realistic horror accounts told this way. The property sat along a narrow gravel road with 6 identical cabins spaced down the ridge at regular intervals. The owner had texted me a keypad code and left a printed sheet on the refrigerator covering quiet hours, trash pickup, and checkout at 11 on Sunday morning. I arrived just before sunset Friday, unpacked groceries, and walked a short section of trail before dark, mostly to shake off the drive. The place looked occupied in minor ways. Chairs out, blinds half open, one porch light left on. But I didn't hear voices, music, doors, or any ordinary noise people make when they're away for the weekend. Around 9:30, while I was making tea, I noticed headlights moving slowly past the front window. The vehicle stopped briefly near one cabin, then the next, pausing each time without anyone getting out. I assumed it was a property manager checking arrivals or confirming reservations. The stove clock read 9:52 when the same headlights passed again. That second loop held my attention only because the road ended at a turnaround. There was no reason I could see for anyone to keep circling the property that way. Saturday morning I took the Ridge Trail and noticed fresh tire marks layered over each other around the turnaround. Through the afternoon, the same dark SUV kept coming past, always slowly, always pausing near each cabin, never parking. Seen once, it meant nothing. Seen 5 or 6 times, it began to suggest a routine. Stranger than the vehicle was the silence around it. The other cabins remained still all day. No coolers outside, no porch conversations, no doors opening, no one visible through the windows, not even the brief practical movements people make carrying in food or stepping out for air. Near sunset, I sat on the porch for a while and heard only wind in the pines and the low engine passing again below me. Just after dusk, the SUV idled a little longer near cabin 12 before moving on slowly. If you enjoy slow-burn, realistic horror, leave a like. After dark, I began noticing the spacing between passes. It was roughly 40 minutes each time, close enough to feel deliberate. The pause outside my cabin also seemed slightly longer than the others. I tested practical explanations, counting occupied units, checking license plates, looking for one specific vehicle. None of them quite fit. The quietness of the property had changed by then too. It no longer felt restful. It felt as if something was moving through a place that wasn't being used the way it appeared to be. Around midnight, I heard the SUV again, but this time it stopped directly in front of my cabin instead of continuing down the row. The headlights were angled away, leaving most of the porch in shadow. I stood in the kitchen without moving and listened. After several minutes, footsteps approached on gravel from the side of the cabin rather than the front steps. They moved along the exterior wall slowly, stopping near each window as if checking inside one room at a time. I turned off the kitchen light and stepped into the hallway where I was out of view. From there I heard the siding give a small dry creak, then silence, then another shift directly beside the living room window. The pause there lasted long enough that I became aware of my breathing and slowed it. I could tell the person was standing close enough to the glass to matter, and close enough to hear anything careless. Eventually the footsteps moved away toward the road. The engine started, the SUV rolled to the turnaround, and then everything went dark. It sat there with the headlights off for several minutes before finally leaving. Once the road was quiet again, I locked the deadbolt, turned off every visible light, and put my car keys, wallet, and phone into my jacket pocket in case I needed to leave quickly. I stayed awake in the bedroom with the lights off, checking the road now and then through a narrow gap in the blinds. I considered calling someone, but the facts sounded thin even to me. A vehicle circling a rental property, someone lingering outside a window, no actual attempt to enter. The SUV never returned. At 6:31, the blinking coffee maker in the kitchen was the first ordinary thing I trusted. Before leaving Sunday morning, I walked down the gravel road toward the entrance sign. In the dust beneath the living room window, I found faint shoe prints where I had heard the weight shift. Similar marks were visible beside two other cabins as well. I stopped and looked for cars, luggage, trash, any sign people had spent the weekend there. There was nothing. At the turnaround, 3 neat loops of tire marks cut over one another in the gravel, repeated too precisely to belong to a single casual turn. On the drive home, I stopped at a gas station near the highway and asked the cashier whether the Ridge cabins stayed busy that time of year. She said early April weekends were usually full. I drove on replaying the property in order. 6 cabins, 1 road, repeated passes, no parked cars. The keypad code still saved in my phone, #4217, has stayed with me. Share this with someone who appreciates grounded horror. Subscribe for the next account. Late February is always the worst stretch of the year for me. I'm 45 and work as an accountant, which means the weeks leading into tax season feel like a slow compression of deadlines and small decisions that all seem to matter at once. After several long nights at the office, my wife suggested I take a short break before the final rush started. I booked 2 nights at a small lodge in the Catskill Mountains of New York. The place advertised minimal winter guests and quiet hiking trails through the surrounding forest. When I arrived Friday evening, snow sat packed across the trees and the entire property felt still. My room was 204. If you enjoy realistic horror accounts like this, consider subscribing for the next one. The lodge was an older 3-story building built around long, straight hallways. Each floor had a central corridor with rooms on either side and a stairwell at the far end. When I pulled into the parking lot, only 3 or 4 cars were scattered across the snow. The front desk clerk told me winter weekends were usually slow. That suited me perfectly. I had brought a few files to review, a novel I had been putting off, and the intention to sleep more than usual. The building itself carried a quiet background sound from the heating system, a soft radiator hiss traveling through the pipes. The hallway outside my room had thick carpet patterned with dark red squares, the kind meant to hide years of foot traffic. Sometime around midnight, I woke briefly and heard footsteps moving slowly down the hallway outside my door. They passed my room, paused for a moment somewhere nearby, then continued toward the stairwell. It sounded like another guest heading downstairs or returning to their room. I didn't think much of it. About 15 minutes later, I heard the same footsteps again. The bedside clock read 12:17 a.m. when I glanced over. The sound was muffled by the carpet, but still clear enough to follow, a slow, deliberate pace moving along the corridor outside. Through Saturday, the same sound returned occasionally. Every time it followed the same path, footsteps traveling the length of the hallway, pausing briefly near the stairwell, then eventually returning in the opposite direction. When I stepped out into the corridor once in the morning, it was empty. I assumed whoever it was had already gone downstairs. By late afternoon, I noticed something else. Every door along the floor looked closed and undisturbed. No luggage outside rooms, no housekeeping carts, no television sounds leaking through the walls. The building remained unusually quiet except for the radiator pipes clicking when the heat turned on. My room sat 4 doors from the stairwell, which meant I heard each pass clearly as the steps moved back and forth along the corridor. If you enjoy slow burn, realistic horror stories, leave a like. Around 1:30 a.m. the footsteps started again. This time they moved more slowly than before. I lay there listening for a moment and realized something I hadn't noticed earlier. During all the pacing I'd heard that day, I had never once heard a door open or close anywhere in the hallway. No latch clicks, no hinges. Whoever was walking never seemed to enter a room. Curious, I opened my door slightly. The hallway lights had dimmed automatically after 1 a.m., leaving the corridor quieter and darker than before. Eventually, curiosity outweighed the mild inconvenience of losing sleep. I stepped out into the hallway to see who was walking around that late. The corridor stretched empty in both directions. The dim lights cast long patches of shadow across the carpet, and the green exit sign glowed faintly above the stairwell door at the far end. For several seconds, nothing moved. Then I heard the footsteps again. They were coming from the stairwell end of the hallway, moving steadily toward me. The sound grew closer with each step, soft, deliberate, evenly spaced. I stayed where I was, standing near the frame of my doorway, expecting someone to appear at any moment. The footsteps reached the section of hallway directly in front of my room, but no one came into view. The sound continued forward, passing directly beside me. As it did, I felt a slight shift in the air against my sleeve, the kind of faint draft that happens when someone walks close by. The steps kept moving past me down the corridor. Still nothing visible. They continued all the way toward the opposite end of the hallway, and eventually faded near the stairwell there. I returned to my room and locked the door. For another hour the same pacing continued outside, down the hall, paused near the stairwell, then back again. Eventually the sound stopped entirely. When morning arrived Sunday, the hallway was silent. I packed my things, took one last look out the window at the snow-covered trees, and went downstairs to check out. Sunlight reflected sharply off the snow through the lobby windows, making the room feel brighter than the rest of the building. The receipt the clerk handed me showed a timestamp of 10:42 a.m. Before leaving, I mentioned something casually to the front desk clerk. I told her I had heard someone walking the hallway most of the night. She looked briefly confused and turned to her computer, pulling up the reservation system. The printer beside her desk began quietly feeding paper. After a moment, she said the second floor had only one guest checked in that weekend. Room 204. The receipt she handed me listed exactly that. Driving home later that afternoon, I kept thinking about the sound itself. The footsteps never echoed like they were coming from the stairs. They never faded into an elevator or a closing door. They always began somewhere along the hallway already. In the rearview mirror, the lodge slowly disappeared behind the trees, sitting alone in the snow-covered forest. Share this story with someone who appreciates grounded horror, and subscribe for the next account.